Welcome to the Faba Bean Micro Summit series. Hi, my name is Tanya Durr, Director of Diversification and Market Insights with Pulse Canada, and I'll be your host for today's event. Faba beans are an emerging ingredient in the food industry that's gaining traction. But with any new ingredient comes questions about where they're from, what they look like, how they're carving their place in this plant-based space that's growing so quickly. So today we have the Faba Bean Micro Summit, and this event takes place over 2 days that are 1 week apart. And today we're going to set the stage on what Canada is doing to support a growing crop, how Faba bean fits in the protein market landscape, and how the different Faba bean ingredients look and function. And it's with this foundation that we hope you can join us next week, the same time, to get some of the practical perspectives from members along the value chain. So today we have 3 speakers, and then next week there'll be 4. But before I introduce, we have just a very simple housekeeping rules. We're going to have presentations, and we'll have some time to take questions at the end of each presentation. So just type your questions into the chat panel on the right-hand side of the screen at any time. And if you find you're having any issues during the session, try refreshing your browser and ensure that you have the play button on the video player on. So with that, allow me to introduce our speakers for today. We have Chris Marinangeli. He's the Senior Director, Research and Regulatory Affairs at Pulse Canada, and he's calling in from Toronto, Ontario. We have Stephanie Matucci, Associate Director of Global Food Science at the Mintel Group, which is headquartered in Chicago. Hi, Stephanie. And we have, last but not least, Mike Nickerson, Professor of Protein Quality and Utilization at the University of Saskatchewan. So please welcome our speakers for the Faba Bean Micro Summit. Now, Chris is going to be our first speaker today. And so he's here right now. And he's going to shed some light on why Canada is investing in Faba beans. And just as a quick background, Chris is a nutritionist, a dietitian by trade. He's worked in the food industry for several years and before joining our team here at Pulse Canada. And he really is, Chris, you're a go-to person for all things research and regulation. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris to present. So Chris.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for the kind introduction. As Tanya mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of a value proposition for Canadian Faba beans. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in Faba beans as a functional ingredient within new food platforms. And I'm going to shed some light on that moving forward, and how Canada is poised to set the stage for addressing the demand for Faba beans moving forward. I'm also going to talk about some of the trends, talking about some of the consumer pull that where Faba beans align quite nicely, and then talk about some of the controversies, the questions that I get asked a lot, particularly around anti-nutritional factors and vicing, convicing, and Favism. But to start things off, the way I typically like to start my presentations is talk about the history, whether it be Faba beans or other policies around consumption. And even though Faba beans are somewhat of I'd say a newer ingredient in North America with respect to a pull for a high protein ingredient, I just want to mention that Faba bean has a rich history in human consumption. And looking at archaeological sites around the world around pulse consumption, looking at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll note that in the Middle East, particularly, history of consumption dates as far back as 10,000 years before present, indicating that Faba beans have been looked to as a source of nutritional sustenance for quite some time. And Faba bean has popped up in other archaeological sites around North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East as well. And then looking very, very quickly, this is Canadian production over the last few years. You can see here there's been an increase in Canadian Faba bean production over the last 5 or 6 years. And this coincides quite nicely with the number of new product launches using Faba bean or Faba bean ingredients within various food platforms. So you are seeing increased interest. There's a rich history there with Faba bean use. And now I'm going to get into some other aspects, dividing up my presentation into 2 pillars, primarily looking at Faba bean, historically good, but even a better future, looking at the value proposition from the perspective of protein and nutrient density. I'm going to give a quick overview of anti-nutritional factors, but my colleague Dr. Nickerson is going to get into it in a little bit more detail. I'm going to talk about phycine, convisine, and favism is something that comes up a lot when we talk about fava beans. So I'm going to give you an overview of favism, mechanism of action, and how favism is addressed as fava beans are processed and cooked, and where the real risk is here. And then transition into the second pillar, that is presenting the Canadian value proposition, talking about Canada's commitment to producing non-vicine, convisine varieties, and our rather large production of non-tannin varieties currently and into the future, high protein across Canadian fava bean varieties, and our leadership on the sustainability front with respect to fava beans. So there is a lot to cover. So I'll jump right in talking about, I guess, the consumer pull and alignment with food trends. And I'd like to start this off by talking about reports from Julian Melliton, who does the New Nutrition Business Key Food Trend Report every year. And it's a fairly comprehensive report where he interviews thousands of industry stakeholders and executives looking at food innovation and what they're seeing in the marketplace and what the future holds. And this is probably of no surprise to individuals listening to this, that protein has been a huge pillar for food innovation over the last 10 years, and 2022 is no different. In 2021, there was a little bit more fractionation in the space, but alternative proteins were still hot, and plants made convenient started to show its head as a distinct trend. But 5 or 6 years ago, the plant-based trend started to get a little bit of momentum, and it's been increasing ever since. This is probably secondary to a lot of global discussions around the value of plant-based ingredients, plant-based diets, increasing the weight of plant protein within dietary patterns, the effects on health and sustainability talked about broadly. Together, this has created a bit of a macro trend around plant protein, and we're seeing that in food innovation. And I think fava bean fits quite nicely. This is a survey, a national representative survey from the US conducted by the International Food Information Council. This is an annual survey that's conducted every year. One of the questions being asked is about the change in consumption of protein sources over the last 12 months. And just to note, at the top of the list there on the left, protein from plant sources was the top, with 24 individuals looking to eat more now, or they somewhat eat more now. So there's something to be said there, and we see it in the innovation space. And again, fava bean fits quite nicely. So when we talk about pulses in general, we talk about the nutrient density. Pulses across dietary guidelines in Canada and around the world are often identified as a protein food, and fava bean is no different. But what sets it apart from, I think, other pulses, which perhaps increases its value as a possible ingredient moving forward, it is a concentrate or an isolate or even a flour, is that the protein levels tend to be higher than other pulses. And you can see here on the chart or the table on the left, fava bean protein levels in as a whole pulse come in at around 26 grams of protein per 100 grams to even greater than 30 grams. And this increases as you dehull fava beans. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. As you dehull fava beans, obviously you're concentrating the protein because you're focusing on the cotyledon. You can get an even higher bump in protein levels. But I think the protein is one side of the story. Obviously, it's important. There's something to be said around nutrient density. And we've seen a vast increase in the offerings of plant-based alternatives using various plant ingredients over the last years, whether it be protein or for other factors. And a lot of the focus in the space has been around technical functionality and sensory profile. And there's been an increased awareness and desire for foods of higher nutrient density. And this is summarized quite nicely. This is a quote I found from the founder of Blueberry Ventures, where he says, there's still white space around the trifecta of taste, price, and nutritional profile. There's been considerable development in the first two, but nutritional profiles have left something to be desired. We'd love to see more tasty products that are highly nutrient dense. And interestingly enough, nutrient density is actually percolating to a top tier food trend as something that consumers are looking for. This probably has something to do with the fact that, nutrient density is starting to be talked about from a policy perspective recently in the latest iteration of US dietary guidelines. And we talk about the nutrient density of fava beans. There's They align quite nicely with other pulses. But again, that protein piece could be quite the differentiator. The fiber piece could be a differentiator. And we are seeing heightened levels of potassium, iron, and folate, similar to other pulses, with folate and iron being nutrients of concern in various age and sex group. So that nutrient density piece is there, particularly if you're using Faba beans as a whole flour or a fractionated flour. A question that we get a lot is around anti-nutritional factors, not only be it about Faba beans, but other pulses. But, you know, when we talk about these are factors found inherently within pulses, including Faba beans, that can interrupt the digestion and bioavailability of certain nutrients that we talk about so much when it comes to the use of these ingredients in foods. But generally speaking, many of these anti-nutritional factors are heat labile and are destroyed when processed or heat is applied in any way. So this is a good example from Dr. Nickerson's lab, who's a subsequent speaker today, looking at whole Faba bean and split Faba bean, looking at the effects on trypsin inhibitor activity, for example. These are compounds that impede the digestibility of protein. As soon as you cook whole Faba beans or split Faba beans, there's no detectable effect or no detectable activity of these trypsin inhibitors. Same can be said as you start to process Faba beans, which is how pulses and Faba beans are typically consumed anyway. Tannins and hemagglutinin activities, which are lectins. Looking at the effects of cooking, autoclave, and germination and extrusion, you can see fairly high reductions in the concentration and activities of these anti-nutritional factors. So typically, as you start to use pulse ingredients, including Faba beans, and platforms that require processing where heat is applied or there has to be some sort of cooking step, generally the anti-nutritional factors decrease. And we do see that, generally speaking, when we consume pulses, they're cooked in some way, even in their whole form. And we do see better effects on nutrient density and various nutritional and cardiometabolic outcomes as pulse consumption increases. To transition now, and I think it's probably synonymous, it's probably aligned quite nicely. I want to take some time to talk about vicine, convicine, and favism, because when we mention Faba beans, individuals in the know often talk about favism and the risk with respect to the use of Faba beans in the presence of these compounds. So I'm going to quickly go over favism generally from a global perspective, the metabolic mechanism and what exactly happens and what we're talking about, and then talk about very, very quickly what happens when we process pulses. So Favism affects about 400 million people worldwide, primarily in the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm not going to get into it, but it is thought to be a protective mechanism in areas where malaria has or continues to be a little bit of a challenge amongst the individuals. Favism has been documented as far back as from the Greek mathematician Pythagoras, who indicated to his followers not to consume Faba beans, probably from demonstration of illness when consuming Faba beans in the Mediterranean region. It's an X-linked genetic disorder characterized by a lack of the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme. It's an enzyme part of the pentose 6-phosphate metabolic pathway. What generally happens is Faba beans contains these two glycosides, vicine and convicine, whose metabolites are essentially toxic in individuals with this deficiency. It manifests itself in the red blood cells, where the pentose phosphate pathway generates NADPH, which is required for energy metabolism, and regenerating glutathione, which is an endogenous antioxidant in the cell. So very, very quickly, to show you what I mean here. So Faba beans contain the alkaloid glycosides vicine and convicine, which we all talk about. And then inherent in the Faba bean, but also within our gut bacteria, there are glucosidase enzymes, which cleave the carbohydrate portion off the glycoside, creating the aglycone, divicine, and isoramyl. And I apologize, I probably didn't say that correctly. So what happens is once that cleavage happens and the aglycone is produced, divicine and its corresponding aglycone are absorbed and make its way into the red blood cell. So this is a red blood cell. This is a normal red blood cell with active glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. And you can see here on the left is the pentose 6-phosphate pathway. And what happens is with normal levels of an enzyme activity, you get generation or regeneration of NADPH. which regenerates glutathione, which is an antioxidant. Glutathione can essentially detoxify or neutralize oxidants. We all talk about antioxidants. Well, it's an antioxidant. It neutralizes things like superoxide anion and particularly here hydrogen peroxide to water and oxygen. But when glutathione, the antioxidant, is used up, producing glutathione disulfide, the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase producing NADPH, it's able to regenerate the glutathione. So that reaction can keep going to detoxify that hydrogen peroxide. What happens in individuals who are lacking this enzyme is you're unable to regenerate that NADPH. So when the visine and divisine and isoramyl make its way into the cell, generating hydrogen peroxide, the glutathione is used up, but it can't be regenerated. So this actually causes an accumulation of hydrogen peroxide, causing oxidative damage to the cell, causing hemolysis or identification by the immune system to remove the red blood cell from the body. So favism in individuals with this deficiency generates jaundice, fever, stomach upset, and in some cases severe inset about 5 hours after consumption. Now, well, this is the story around favism, and this is the underlying concern when we talk about faba bean consumption. Individuals who don't have this disorder can consume faba beans like any other pulse, and it's important to note that it is a rare disorder, although it does cause some hesitation in using the ingredient. It's important to also note that most cases of favism occurs with the consumption of raw beans. Fava beans are consumed as a pulse, which would be the dry version or a mature bean, but also as a immature bean in the sense that it's consumed prior to drying as a vegetable. And that's where most of the cases of favism attacks do occur. Generally speaking, levels of convisine and visine are higher in immature beans compared to mature beans. And in general, when we're talking about fava beans as a pulse, processing is effective at reducing levels of visine and convisine, as well as deactivating the endogenous glycoside enzymes that create the aglycone that causes the issues in those individuals with the deficiency. So this is just some data that I pulled, just looking at soaking and cooking of whole split fava beans on visine and convisine levels. And you can see here, just looking at levels of the alkaloid glycosides, visine and convisine, you get up to 38% reduction just by cooking, not considering the reduction in endogenous glycoside enzymes. Looking at dry fractionation of fava beans, looking at the protein fraction, you do get a concentration of visine and convisine. So looking at dry fractionation, you probably want to apply a step in your processing to destroy or reduce visine, convisine. But again, remembering that favism is a fairly rare disorder found within populations. And then here looking at fava bean isolates. So here a fava bean isolate, the last line here that's circled, 91% protein. The isolate produced from aqueous extraction, isoelectric precipitation. You can see that visine convisine levels are non-detectable in this particular study. And this has been mirrored in Dr. Nickerson's lab. I'm just going to show this very, very quickly. Looking at various Canadian varieties of fava beans going from the flour to the isolate, and you can see up to a 57% reduction in levels of visine, convisine, and in some varieties non-detectable in both the flour and the isolate version. So with all that background, now I'm going to start talking about and go over the Canadian value proposition and how Canada is poised to have a high fava bean production with a high value proposition for industry. And that is the focus on low visine, non-visine varieties moving forward, our focus on non-tannin variety development and production, consistently high protein varieties in Canada, and then our leadership on the side of sustainability. So when we look at fava bean production on a global scale, Canada is and remains to be a fairly small player. The leading producers being China, Ethiopia, UK, Australia, and France, and exporters being Australia, UK, Lithuania, Egypt, Latvia. Looking at production being Faba bean percentage of variable land with respect to production. It's been actually separated into two graphs on the left because I think the distinguish between the various production in various regions. You can see China, Egypt on the left, fairly large production compared to Australia, France, and the UK on the right. And you can see where Canada sits up until 2005, fairly small player in that space. That being said, since 2005, production in Canada and seeded acres has substantially increased from below 25,000 acres in 2005 to upwards of 100,000 in 2021. And just to what we talked about, I'll start off with the Visine convisine just because that's what I just finished talking about. Canada has started producing non-Visine convisine varieties across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, with the Fabel variety as a tannin variety and the DL Rico variety as a non-tannin variety. That being said, the majority of our production does remain to contain Visine and convisine relative to the non-Visine varieties, but we are seeing that uptick, and it is starting. And it is important to note that moving forward, as part of the 2020 merit assessment for Faba bean varieties measured in Canada, as per the Prairie Recommended Committee for Pulse and Special Crops, as of 2020, to enter the Western Canada Faba bean co-op trial on recommended varieties, you must be submitting a low Visine convisine content variety of Faba bean. So moving forward, the varieties being developed in Canada will be all non-Visine convisine varieties moving forward. Moving forward to the low tannin varieties, most of the varieties produced in Canada, most production is around the no tannin varieties, which there is considerable variety in this space, with the primary production being the snowbird variety. And you can see relative to the non-tannin seeded acres in Canada, it really is focused on the non-tannin variety, with percentage upwards of over 90% in 2019 and around 85% in 2021. And again, the majority being that snowbird variety that we're seeing. So why the focus on non-tannin varieties? Well, there's higher protein and energy digestibility in monogastric feed applications. But on the human side and the ingredient side, it is associated with less color, flavor, and odor for increased palatability and acceptability in food and ingredient applications, with the ability to incorporate both Fava flours into products as well as as proteins. Tannins are generally concentrated in the seed coat, so the play here would really be as we're seeing increased utilization of flours and getting that neutral taste that you would probably want as you're starting to innovate with food products. And some data do suggest that non-tannin varieties do come with higher protein content. This is data from a review by Quipon et al. Published in 2010, where we summarized tannin and crude protein levels across two studies. And you'll note here on the left, the high tannin varieties had lower crude protein levels, as seen on the right, with the low tannin varieties having about a 5% increase in protein levels. That being said, this is from a recent thesis that was published at the University of Saskatchewan, looking at Canadian varieties. This study did note that there was no difference in crude protein content between non-varieties and tannin varieties, with a mean protein content of 28%. But it's worthwhile to note that across the board, the protein levels were still high regardless. In addition, when you look at Faba beans, again, compared to other pulses, that value proposition around protein levels are quite robust across the board. This is a summary of data from Matt Noseworthy and Jim House, looking at protein levels and processing of pulses across the board. And Faba beans generally have a higher protein, as I mentioned before, across protein levels. Now, one thing to consider, and I think Dr. Nickerson is going to get into it in a little bit more detail, is protein quality. Everyone is interested in protein quality when we talk about food innovation. Generally speaking, plant foods have a lower protein quality than animal-based protein. So there is an opportunity to blend to enhance the protein quality, where in Canada, you want to get to the content level where you're getting a claim for a source or a good source of protein within your food products. So on the left here, using, again, the data from Dr. Noseworthy, you're looking at crude protein content compared to, say, beans, other beans, dry beans. The crude protein content is quite a bit higher. However, when you're looking at the protein quality, there is some lag there compared to uh, dry beans and other pulses with respect to the protein quality. And when we look at it, looking at, say, adding various pulse ingredients to whole grain flour, and you can see the bottom on the left-hand side here, PDCAS being the metric for protein quality. You can see adding faba bean concentrate, faba bean isolate doesn't cause that complementarity in PDCAS that you would probably want to see across the board as you're adding, when you're looking just at protein quality, adding to whole grain flour. But when you're looking at corrected protein content, and given the high protein content of something like a faba bean isolate, the results are a little bit different. And you can see here with this dark line that at around 20%, just over 20% increase, adding to whole grain, assuming a final flour concentration of fiber level around 30 grams, you are getting to a level where you would get a corrected protein content claim. Now that is more isolate than compared to, say, a split pea isolate, protein isolate. But when you consider things like clean taste, functionality, that might be a value proposition that you're better able to work with respect to innovation. So that high protein content, while the protein quality might be lower, you might still produce a high value innovative product that is more acceptable to consumers, even though you might have to add a little bit more. And then finally, I want to touch very, very quickly on the sustainability. When we talk about sustainability of pulses, we often focus on nitrogen fixation, the ability to fix nitrogen from the air and add nitrogen to the soil. And across the board, when you compare faba beans to other pulses, the nitrogen fixation ability of faba beans outranks other pulses. Look down here at the bottom too, it's worthwhile to note, this is cited often in the literature, that faba beans in North America, 88% of the nitrogen in the plant is coming from fixed nitrogen, and this data is actually Canadian data, and I've pulled it out on the right hand side of the screen here from Wally et al, comparing faba beans, Canadian produced faba beans, to other pulses produced in Canada, with faba bean coming up as a higher nitrogen fixing crop compared to other pulses. So there is a value proposition here for Canada moving forward. This is a growing sector, and I think there is a value add here, looking at the trends in place. And what we're seeing right now, and I think Dr. Nickerson is going to get into it in a little bit more detail, how faba beans are performing, and the technologies that are available to processing pulses into a palatable high value ingredient across various food platforms are increasingly coming to light. And I think Canada has a lot to offer with respect to this space. So hopefully the key takeaways from my presentation are faba beans obviously are nutrient dense food that aligns with global trends around increasing plant protein and nutrient density in food platforms. As with other pulses, processing faba beans largely eliminates anti-nutritional factors as a factor that would hinder consumption or cause for concern. There is a distinct value proposition for Canadian produced faba beans. Canadian production continues to grow with a focus on low tannin and no visine production. There's a commitment in place to produce non-visine, no visine varieties moving forward. These non-tannin varieties have better hedonic properties and perhaps functionality across food platforms, a value add to industry. And the nitrogen capability of Canadian faba beans is a value proposition for those hoping to leverage sustainability within their supply chain. So with that, I'll be happy to try and answer any questions and transition to the next speaker. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for that informative presentation. There was a lot there. It's a growing sector, and new varieties are in the pipeline, and there's opportunity for this value add. So in terms of nutrition and sustainability. So we've got a few questions here that are trickling in, and I know you covered a lot about favasm, and this is an important condition to acknowledge, and you outlined that really well. And so there's a few questions here relating to that. And I'll just, in no particular order, there's questions about relationship between age and favasm. Can you comment on that, Chris?
Yeah, I'm unaware. I didn't come across that in any great detail. Most of the cases of fava bean come from case reports. There's from my understanding, reading some of the medical literature, there's no definitive tracking of favism in cases of favism. So it is estimated that, bouts of favism amongst those with the deficiency in the enzyme, um, case reports are higher than what is reported. Most of the cases do occur in children, from what I read, and that's probably stems from parents bringing them to see a doctor after bouts of favism emerge. But that is my understanding. I'm not sure if bouts of favism or severity would wane as somebody gets older. I didn't come across that, but reports generally happen in children, probably from just a function that they are children and being looked after to some extent.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think there was just another comment just about the naming of this condition and it's how unfortunate that is. But I think you also in your presentation covered about the impacts of processing and how that can diminish some of these compounds that are present in fava beans. And there was a question on just clarifying some of on your table 4 you had the convisine levels in different crops there, and the question was just whether it was based on snowbird or if there was other varieties that were being covered.
Table 4. Sorry, I'm gonna have to go back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can follow up with that question.
Yeah, I can follow up. I'll get that
Perfect.
answer probably
Okay.
after
Yeah.
the next speaker.
Okay. Well, and I think I think this really sets the stage on what the current data is, and there's a lot of opportunity to position fava beans as a protein-rich ingredient, has fiber, but there's also these other considerations that need to be made. And so, what we'll do is we'll conclude this your presentation here, and we'll also have some opportunity to ask a few more questions at the end of the event, but we will move on to our Mintel presentation, who's going to be Stephanie. So our next speaker.
Hi.
Sure. So
Make sure I'm live.
wonderful.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. So Stephanie, hi. So we're going to move on to getting a better understanding of the market landscape for fava bean innovations. And I just wanted to mention, so we have Stephanie here from Intel, and she's unique because she has a background in food science. So she really brings in some interesting perspectives on the technical opportunities in today's very quickly evolving market. So we're going to get a little snapshot of what it's looking like out there for fava beans in the market.
Great.
So Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be with you to talk about food innovation with fava beans. And today we're going to be discovering some of those growing uses for fava bean ingredients and look at new opportunities across the industry and the global market. But before we get started, just wanted to add to that brief introduction about myself and on Mintel. As Tanya said, I'm Stephanie Matucci, Associate Director of Food Science at Mintel, and I've been with Mintel close to a decade now. And prior to that, I was a food scientist at an ingredient company in Chicago. So my role at Mintel is to really help our clients understand what consumers want and why. So I provide insights on food ingredients, nutrition, and new technologies. And as the world leading market intelligence agency, Mintel's analysis of consumers, markets, product innovation, and competitive landscapes provides a unique perspective on global and local economies. Since 1972, our predictive analytics and expert recommendations have enabled our clients to make those better business decisions faster. Mintel's expert-led approach and global footprint really allows us to help you grow your business and offer our clients better and more relevant answers with expertise you can rely on. So with that, today's goal is to really get you excited about innovating with fava beans. We'll be looking at where fava bean ingredients are being used today, what new innovations we're seeing, and how this ingredient has a future, not only as a sustainable protein, but also as a clean label ingredient with excellent functional capacities. So first, let's understand a little bit more about fava beans and where they've traditionally been used and where they're headed. Fava bean protein is one of the newer proteins on the market, offering both sensory benefits and a sustainability story. Now, when we compare it to other plant proteins like soy, fava bean is found in much fewer product launches. So this chart right here is using Mintel's Global Product Database, GMPD. So we're tracking new product launches around the world across 86 markets, capturing 40,000 product launches every month. And with this tool, you're able to see these trends playing out in the market. So what claims are being used on products, what ingredients are being used in those products, in what categories, what markets, and so on. So for example, this chart is showing the percentage of food and drink launches by region that contains a fava bean ingredient. So that's a fava bean, just on the label, fava bean flour, protein, concentrate, isolate. So for example, if we compare it to something like soy, which is much more common, for soy, 12% of global food and drink product launches contain a soy ingredient. When it comes to fava, it's far fewer than that. But I think it's really important to note that even though soy is more common, we've seen that ingredient stagnating or even declining in some regions or categories, where fava bean ingredients are showing growth. Although it's coming from a really small base, in the past 5 years, that percentage of global food and drink launches with a fava bean ingredient is up 56%. Fava beans actually do have a really long history. As Chris was mentioning in his presentation, there's lots of archaeological evidence showing fava beans being used. There was an interesting article I was reading in Scientific America talking about how fava bean is the oldest, some of the oldest cultivated crops dating back to 6000 BC. And legend has it that fava beans might even be the very beans found in Jack and the Beanstalk. It's also used in traditional recipes across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, things like falafel or full madames. We see that example here in a lot of those traditional type products. Now, when we look at product launches over the last 5 years, we see that in APAC, Asia Pacific, the types of ingredients that are being used in those products that contain fava beans are largely being driven by the fava bean itself and fava bean flour. So within the APAC region, 72% of product launches that contained a fava bean ingredient, 72% of those had fava bean on the label, whereas fava bean flour was 41%. Typical categories that you can think of for those type of launches were things like vegetables. You can think canned or dried beans, side dishes like falafel, cooking sauces. We have an example of a cooking sauce from Szechuan, which is a fermented sauce using fava beans, chili peppers, wheat flour, and salt to make a fermented cooking paste there. We also see vegetable snacks like fried or dried fava beans also being very common across the APAC region. Now, if we turn and look at Europe and North America, there are other ingredients that are actually driving the innovation. Fewer products are being launched with fava, but it is something that's growing in these two markets. So in Europe, we see fava beans are the leading ingredient on the label, similar to APAC. But what's interesting is we really see a lot of fava bean flour and fava bean protein being popular ingredients on the label. Now, when it comes to North America, fava bean protein is the top fava bean ingredient being used. 53% of launches in North America that contained a fava bean ingredient contained fava bean protein. Other ingredients, fava bean, 30% of those launches, and fava bean flour was about 12%. What's also interesting about the North American market is seeing the types of proteins that are being launched. Some more refined proteins are found in North American launches like fava bean protein isolate, fava bean protein concentrate. Still a small number of products, but I think it really has potential to grow as these type of ingredients bring new functionality and new benefits to plant-based products. And what I find really interesting is the range of new innovation using these fava bean ingredients. Everything from a fava bean protein powder in Australia. So this particular product is from Coles, which is a grocery store chain in Australia. And it's a fava bean protein powder that you can buy. You can add it directly to your smoothie or even use it to replace eggs in recipes at home. Other examples are using fava bean as the sole plant protein. For example, V8 here, this is another product from Australia that's actually using fava bean protein isolate as the only protein source in that product, providing 5 grams of protein per serving. And that plant-based positioning is something that's taking off in other products too. Everything from a plant-based jerky in the US to other meat alternatives as well as dairy alternatives where fava bean ingredients are being used for their functional benefits. You can see that those type of benefits playing out across the different regions when we take a look at what are the top categories or subcategories per region that contain a fava bean ingredient. In APAC and the Middle East Africa, it's in those traditional categories: vegetable snacks, vegetables, instant noodles, cooking sauces, side dishes, some meat substitutes. But when we look at Europe and North America, we see those fava bean ingredients, especially fava bean proteins and flours, being used for its functionality in bread products and plant-based products like plant dairy alternatives and meat substitutes. And fava bean has a lot of potential, especially as today's consumers are looking to get more out of their foods. Those nutrient-dense ingredients, especially as Chris was talking about, that's emerging as a trend in the food industry. Nutrient-dense ingredients and positive nutrition claims are going to really appeal to those consumers who are looking for healthy foods. But pairing those nutrition claims with taste is something that's going to further increase the appeal of these healthy products. And innovating with fava beans can help reach those health conscious consumers, especially if we look at something like the satiety angle. So in the US, 73% of consumers agree they mainly look for foods to be filling. So that could further be strengthened by the fiber and the protein claims that some fava ingredients can provide. Fava bean itself is rich in protein, rich in fiber, so it's really positioned well for these new and healthy innovations. Already looking at those product launches that contain a fava bean ingredient, 10% of global launches had a high protein claim on them, and 8% had a high fiber claim on them. So brands are already starting to use that positioning on those types of products. So not only are fava beans a pulse with high protein content, but they're also an excellent source of fiber and minerals. We see that being used in various healthy snacks where fava beans are being used to add protein, fiber, or texture to new products. The first one is an example from a product from Australia where we see crunchy fava beans added to the top of a smooth avocado dip to give it extra crunch as well as nutrition. And in the United Arab Emirate, bada bean, bada boom, that's a hard one, one for me to say, is a healthy snack made just of dried fava beans. And it really boldly shows that this crunchy snack has 21 grams of protein per bag, also is high in fiber, all while being free from gluten and soy. Other innovations are on the lines of healthier vegetable-based crisps, as we see as this example from Blackstone in Australia. Good fava bean chips here is using a flour mix containing 33% fava bean flour, maize flour, whole grain sorghum flour, and chickpea flour, along with other ingredients to create a crunchy gluten-free chip. And that gluten-free area is something that we see fava ingredients being used, including bakery. So in addition to snacks making those gluten-free claims, also in the bakery category, globally, 18% of bakery launches that contained a fava bean ingredient made a gluten-free claim in the last 5 years. Now, in Europe, where we just saw bakery was that leading category for fava bean ingredients, only 6% of those launches in Europe had a gluten free claim. So, what's going on? Well, gluten free bakery items aren't the only products that are benefiting from the functional benefits of fava bean. Many of these bakery items in Europe, when we looked at the way they were describing the texture, they described them as being soft, fluffy, or light, suggesting that the fava bean flour was being used in those products to support the texture of the bakery items instead of being used to formulate a gluten-free product. Fava bean flour, which is high in protein, offers some technical benefits such as water binding and other structural support that can really support those texture claims that they're talking about. We see here some of these products that are described that way. So this is the first one is an example of a classic toast bread from Greece that uses fava bean flour and is described as being extremely soft in texture. The second one is a gluten-free bread from Sweden that is using it to the protein here to support that gluten-free product. Fava bean ingredients also hold a lot of potential in pastas with the ability to add protein and fiber to these products, but also to improve the texture and flavor of gluten-free pastas. And more nutritious pasta is something that US consumers are interested in. So almost half of adults in the US are interested in a high protein pasta. 45% are interested in a vegetable based pasta, and 42% in a high fiber pasta, which is something that gluten or fava bean flour can help support some of those initiatives. Recent launches of fava bean in pastas are really touting those sensory benefits of a fava bean flour alongside the nutritional ones. So, for example, this first product, which is an organic pasta in the US, is offering 25 grams of protein per serving. And the manufacturer goes into some of the historical information about fava beans, claiming it's one of the oldest domesticated food legumes. And it's also talks about how that particular ingredient makes it closer to traditional wheat pasta in terms of taste, texture, and color. Also talking about the mild and creamy flavor, high in protein, and high in fiber. The second product on the screen is a black protein pasta from Italy that is also promoting the protein and fiber benefits found in fava beans. And we also see fava beans being used in blends. We see at the end a gluten-free spaghetti in the US that blends cauliflower, rice flour, and fava beans to create a gluten-free spaghetti and a plant-based pasta that's free from all 8 major allergens. Now, in addition to supporting gluten-free formulations, fava bean proteins also hold great potential for plant-based products. And this is where I think we'll see a lot of the innovation for fava bean proteins in Europe and North America. Already, recent plant-based launches using fava bean ingredients for texture and nutrition across the plant-based categories. So, just looking at some of the examples from Europe, especially from the UK, that we see fava bean protein being used to replace eggs, as it is here in this mayo, this vegan mayo from Leon. Textured fava bean protein is being used to mimic chicken in the following No Chicken Kiev from the UK, which is using a texturized fava bean protein to mimic that flavor of chicken. And the final product, which is from Milk, it's a plant-based barista blend that's blending different plant-based ingredients to create a foamable barista-style milk that you can use in latte and other type drinks. And what's interesting about this launch is that it talks specifically about why each ingredient was added. So it claims that oats were added for smoothness, coconut for creaminess, and fava beans for savoriness. What's also unique about it is it gives you that dairy-free product without the need of having any preservatives, thickeners, or stabilizers. So I think that's something that we'll see fava bean used for in some of those clean label products as it can offer some of those functional benefits. Now, when we talk about plant-based foods, there is a lot of growth in that category that we've seen. Plant-based sales of plant-based products have been booming in recent years in the US. Sales of meat substitutes saw a huge surge in 2020, thanks in great part to more cooking at home. But we also saw the plant-based meat substitute market really enjoying that strong and steady growth in recent years, thanks to a number of factors such as improved taste, texture, wider availability, and more competitive prices. And consumers may be choosing plant based proteins for a number of reasons, but when we look at online conversations about plant based proteins, we see that they're largely focused on health and wellness. And those strong associations between plant based proteins and health and wellness will continue to drive the market beyond what we've seen from COVID-19. That influence of cooking at home. Additionally, those connotations of plant-based proteins being healthier for humans, animals, and the planet and the environment overall makes it something that will continue to grow, especially for those consumers who are looking for meat-like substitutes but don't want to miss out on eating meat itself. And we see ingredient companies paying attention to the potential of fava bean protein or fava bean ingredients in plant-based alternatives. So, for example, Ingredion claims that their fava bean protein has a really clean flavor profile without the beany notes that are typically found in legume-based proteins. Their fava bean protein can be used to add protein to products, but it can also be used as an egg replacer. Roquette has also developed a texturized fava bean protein that has a fibrous texture to add more bite or firm texture to various meat analogs. And we see Prairie Fava's fava flour claims to support a wide range of different plant-based applications, meat applications, as well as vegan condiments, dips, and sauces. And the company claims that using a whole food fava ingredient offers products various nutritional benefits like high in protein, fiber, and micronutrients. I think fava bean protein and fava bean flour really have a lot of potential to improve those next generation meat alternatives. Studies have found that fava bean protein isolates have excellent gelling properties as well as water and mineral absorption or oil absorption capacities. Um, Legumin, which is a specific globulin protein found in both soy and fava beans, is known to create a better curd texture than those smooth peas or lentils, which can lead to a firmer, more cohesive curd, improving the texture of that final product. So I think that holds a lot of potential for the category, especially as these are things that consumers are really seeking out in these type of products. One of those being that clean label attribute. So 75% of U.S. consumers who eat plant-based meat alternatives agree that the ingredient content influences their purchase of meat alternatives. And plant-based protein consumers are also looking for variety, with 25% in the US and 28% in Canada say that they shop for new plant-based proteins they look for the new options where they shop. And these ingredients can improve the sensory attributes of plant-based alternatives, potentially bringing more consumers to the category too, especially as the current taste of some of these products is a deterrent for 54% of non-users in Canada. Dairy alternatives, in addition to meat alternatives, can benefit from sensory improvements, especially as we see when we ask consumers about the reasons why they're using dairy alternatives. Only 29% say they use dairy alternatives because they prefer the taste, and only 17 prefer the texture of dairy alternatives compared to real dairy. So when we know that taste is a major driver for the reason why people are buying something and continue to buy it, there's some room to grow there in terms of getting people to really enjoy the taste and the texture of those dairy alternatives. I've seen fava bean protein starting to be used in various dairy alternative products, things like oat-based or coconut-based products. In those products, it might be used as a lower level, perhaps, either as an emulsifier or as a foam stabilizer. Um, but that one of the other advantages of using fava bean in some of these products is that it can support some of the other reasons why consumers are choosing plant-based products, and that's the environmental reasons. In fact, 26% of U.S. dairy alternative consumers say that they use dairy alternatives because it's better for the environment. And in Europe, we're already seeing that local and plant-based trend converging with sustainable plant proteins. We've seen brands in Europe responding by turning to more local crops for those sustainable sources of plant protein. So recent product launches not only make local claims related to the crops. For example, we see this the Scandinavian product here. It's from Norway using blends of Scandinavian peas and beans, really leaning into the provenance of those ingredients in that localized tempeh. And we also see it here in this chickpea nugget from France that is using specifically using legumes raised on sustainable French farms. So really keeping it local in that product there. But interestingly enough, it's not just those plant-based categories that are looking for more local sources of crops. We also see in Denmark, for example, there's a dairy producer, Theis, that has pledged to drop soy completely from its animal feed by 2023. And instead, they're going to replace that soy with Danish-grown alternatives. So fava beans, lupins, and peas that can be grown on the farmer's own fields. And this idea of localism is important in Europe, where we see 44% of UK adults agreeing that meat substitutes that contain ingredients that are sourced in the UK are more appealing than those that are sourced elsewhere. But I think that this concept has potential to grow in other regions as well. Chris was talking about the sustainability of fava beans, and that's definitely an area that I think can be promoted, especially as we see consumers talking more about sustainability and asking more questions about the impact that the food they eat has on the world around them. As a nitrogen fixing crop, fava beans can definitely be positioned as a sustainable crop to improve soil fertility and reduce the need for added fertilizers. We know fava beans have long been used as a cover crop or for animal feed, but it can really thrive as an ingredient in food and drink products too, especially as consumers are looking to incorporate those plant-based foods into their diet. And I think soil health is one of those that is emerging as one of the newest pillars of sustainability for environmentally friendly products, and something that can be talked about, when it comes to the fava bean cultivation and how fava beans can improve soil physical properties, things like bulk density, porosity, water content at field capacity. So those are some other areas to really lean into the specifics of how fava beans are really playing into sustainability. So ingredients like fava beans, really can offer consumers that sustainable nutrition that they're looking for. Foods that offer health benefits and are good for the environment have potential to grow as a superfood, especially at a time, when consumers are questioning the larger impact that their dietary choices have on the world around them. Today we've discussed how fava bean protein is just starting to hit the market and has potential to grow as brands look to improve their products, especially plant-based products. As a high protein pulse, fava beans have potential to grow as consumers seek out more plant based proteins and prioritize plant based eating. But brands should also be able to utilize fava beans' functional benefits. That includes things like gelling properties, or using it as a clean label replacement for various ingredients, and use it to improve the texture of various plant based products. And finally, fava beans, like other pulses, is recognized as a sustainable crop that can help improve soil fertility. So look for ways to incorporate sustainability messages about the benefits of fava beans when educating consumers about this ingredient. With that, I believe we have some time for some questions. Let me hop over and see what we got.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for that presentation. And we do have just a few minutes for presentations. And I encourage you all to type in your questions in the chat as early as possible so we can catch them, because I know we missed a few last there. So I'll just get right into it. And this might have been for Chris, but I think this is relevant to your presentation and you touched on it. So you talked a lot about blends of pulse to have a good source of protein. That was Chris, perhaps. Yep. And you did touch on some blends like with other cereal grains. And so maybe just reiterate, what kind of blends did you see as that was interesting for the market and that was good taste? And maybe just comment on is it the cereal-based foods, plants, like the meats, the milks categories, etc. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, what's interesting is, when looking at the blends, it really depends on the category and what you're trying to accomplish with those ingredient blends. But what I found interesting about looking at fava and having looked at other ingredients in the past and seeing them grow, it really reminds me of how pea started. You saw pea protein being used as a functional ingredient to start with. As the market started to grow and we got more technology and more refinement in terms of those ingredients, we saw pea protein really explode on the market. And I wonder if we'll see the same thing with fava here, because it's starting to be used, at least in the America and Europe, kind of as a functional ingredient. And how can that grow as we see that over time? So right now, I think I saw a lot of blends actually with pea when it came to fava. But again, it depends on the category that you're looking at and where it's being used and what kind of outcome you're looking for.
Great. Yeah, so it's clear that a lot of companies are taking advantage of these new ingredients and even positioning their products accordingly. And there was questions about the ingredients themselves, and I think there's some of those that will be addressed in the next in Mike's presentation. But is textured fava beans commercially available in Canada? Yes. I'll address that as well. But one question, I think, just with your perspective on, you've been analyzing the ingredients market, you're seeing new ingredients come and go and sticking around. And I guess just generally speaking, from your perspective, you've looked at fava beans, and what are your thoughts on just where fava beans are in their growth cycle? Because it's a new crop.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think we're at the early stages, right? It's going to take some time to get that ingredient up and going and getting it enough of it, getting the farmers involved, getting the producers involved, and then getting the product developers to start to incorporate in those products. But, it really depends on the size, get those big players in, you have to have enough of it in order to make those big launches and make them stick around. So, I think if we look at something like pea, it took about 10 years for it to get to where it is today, at least. So I think we can, say that we're kind of at that early stages of it.
Yeah. So a crop with lots of potential.
Absolutely.
Working together. Okay, and then the slides will be available. Yes, and there's lots of questions kind of slipping through here. I guess there's a question on more on the functionality, but it was on tofu products. Did you see anything in your scan of the market on the tofu side?
I did not look at tofu specifically, but hopefully one of my technical speakers will be able to speak to that at some point. No, I don't have information on that. I see on the next question why the industry would want to replace soy for animal feeding. That was a specific example in Denmark, actually, where they're looking to really source local ingredients in their animal feeds. So for them in that market, they were importing soy. So they're looking to turn to more local crops, and that's why they would be replacing soy in that Denmark example.
Okay, great. And so we're gonna wrap this one up, but I wanted to just also mention that because you did highlight some of the ingredient players, we're gonna hear from some of those ingredient players next week as well. But we do have a link to members of our Canadian Special Crops Association that's involved with the trade. Some are supplying ingredients, some are distributing. So there's a link here right on the platform that you can access. So I just wanted to mention that. But I guess with that, I just wanted to say thanks, Stephanie, for presenting on the market landscape. And so we're going to transition now to our last speaker. That's Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Okay, so you're our last speaker for our event today, and I just as an introduction, you've presented at past micro summits, and you've been relentlessly working on pulse proteins for 15 years, and that's a lot of time and lots of publications to show for. So today you're going to give a crash course on fava bean functionality. It's a new crop, but lots has been done. So you can give us a tour.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tanya. It's really good to take a part in this event. Yeah, as Tanya mentioned, I've done a lot of work for the last 15, 20 years on fractionation of pulses, deflavoring, functionality, processing, and some high-value applications. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about fava beans, because I think there's a tremendous potential in the future, and it looks quite bright, I think, as an emerging protein source. So just to give you a sort of an overview of the protein market, and this will build a little bit off Stephanie and Chris's presentation, but right now the global protein market is worth about 52 billion a couple of years ago, and by 2025 it's supposed to be 70 billion. Now this is both plant and animal sources, and even though it's dominant by animal proteins, there's a significant market push, as we mentioned earlier, towards plant-based sources or alternative protein sources in the marketplace. Now, as of this year, the global plant protein market is about 10 billion, and that's really dominated by soya in the marketplace and wheat. Pea protein, which across the prairies, it's exploding right now, but even now it's still quite small, about 39 million value compared to some of the other plant protein ingredients. So it's still considered an emerging protein. Fava bean is coming up behind pea as a potential, and Chris talked about the high protein content, and this is really attractive when we talk about fractionation. And I'll show some data later, but obtaining higher value or higher protein yields in the dry products or the wet extraction process. The global protein market is supposed to double by 2050. So I'll talk a little bit about some of these macro drivers driving the protein markets. So, why now? There's a number of macro drivers out there. One is population growth. How are we supposed to feed 9-10 billion people by 2050 with a nutritious, high quality protein feedstock that's sustainable? We talked about sustainability, and Stephanie did a good job on that, talking about livestock feed is very land intensive, so these plant-based alternatives are attractive for the environment. There's less ethical issues about animal welfare. So that's creating some market drivers. Urbanization, so we see in these a lot of people from rural areas are migrating to urban centers, and with that, we see changes in the dietary patterns of people and their diets. So they're consuming higher amounts of protein and diverse sources of protein in that as well. There's also changing demographics. So, I think there's about 31% of the population in the world is millennials, and 57% in Asia and China, where we see most of the demand for changing protein. And, with such high demographics, they have higher purchasing power. They're living at home longer. They're demanding more protein and diverse protein sources. So you see changes in the dietary patterns. Other drivers pushing changes in the protein market are health risks associated with the consumption of animal proteins, perceived risks of mad cow. So plant proteins are becoming more popular. And we see that reflected in some of the nutritional regulators in different countries. Canada, for instance, a couple of years ago came out with their new Canada Food Guide, and they're reducing the amount of milk in exchange for alternative protein sources such as from legumes and pulses, and this is where I think faba bean has big potential, like other pulses, to play a big role. But these changes in regulatory guidelines are really affecting people's dietary patterns, in which are affecting buying power. And this is seen in other countries as well, not just in Canada. Now, when we look at faba beans, I think they're ideally positioned. As everyone knows, they're part of the legume family, and what's really attractive about them is they're high in protein, much higher than pea. So 23 to 33% protein versus pea, which is around 23%. They're high in fiber and low in fat. So they're nutritional powerhouse, and Chris talked a little bit about how nutritionally dense they are. When we look at the proteins, and that's my interest, similar to other pulses, they're rich in lysine, which is an important essential amino acid, but tend to be deficient in the sulfur amino acids like cysteine and methionine and tryptophan. And this creates a nutritional gap. So quite often they're consumed or recommended to be consumed alongside of cereals, which are nutrition and deficient in others. And so a lot of vegetarians, they'll mix and match pulses and cereals to make sure they have a complete balance of amino acids. And there were some questions about blending of proteins, and so there's a lot of opportunities, and I'll make some recommendations later in this thing about the protein quality. Is blending pulses and cereals together, not only to obtain unique or higher protein quality so we can make protein claims like Chris talked about, but also changes to the functional attributes to get blended ingredients, and how does that work in terms of product development. Now, in terms of the protein, faba beans, they're dominant by two types of proteins, legumins and bissolins. They're both storage proteins, but they have different structures and composition and different functionalities. So depending on the genotype that you're working with or in the environment or processing, you can get faba bean ingredients with different ratios of these two proteins. And that can have an impact on how they behave as ingredients when we start adding them to food products. Now, to date, the primary target is the domestic feed market, but there are a lot of work is being pushed for faba beans into food markets, because there's a tremendous amount of application, especially with these changing consumer trends. Now, when we talk about value-added processing, as we go sort of left or right across the slide, we're increasing costs of production, but we're also increasing value because we're adding protein, changing functionality and nutrition. So if we start on the left, dehulling and milling is sort of the initial stage in terms of value-added processing of faba beans, and we can remove the hull, and that gets rid of a lot of the phenolics and tannins that we see in faba beans. gets rid of some bitter tasting notes in Faba. So the ingredients tend to be a little blander than pea, for instance. And it allows us through milling to control particle size. So particle size has a big impact on flour properties and functionality. So by changing the milling conditions, we can start tailoring the functionality to certain product applications. Now, dry fractionation, one of the big interests is because of the high protein content in the pea flour or the Faba flour. Go in the dry concentrate, you can get up to 65% protein, which is really attractive, especially if you're getting into the meat analog areas. So Faba bean is quite regularly processed in terms of air classification. There is a new technique that's emerging called Triboelectric Separation, and this is not used for Faba beans yet. It's being explored. It's coming from the mining industry, and it's being explored now in the pulses and cereals area, from a lab bench about the possibilities. But basically, what this does is it takes the flour, it suspends it and passes it through some charging plates. It creates a charge on the protein and then leaves the starch neutral. So it allows you to separate the protein from the starch within an electric field to create an enriched protein fraction and starch-rich fraction. So they're looking at it as possibly a pre-treatment step prior to air classification or afterwards. And then we have wet fractionation. The alkaline isoelectric precipitation is the most common used commercially for the pulses, including Faba. Salt extraction and micellar precipitation for pulses is typically done at the benchtop research scale, but ultrafiltration, that's another way that we can extract proteins or filter out proteins, get unique fractions. However, that tends to be quite expensive than the other ones. The whole idea is that we can create high value fractions, whether it's a hull fiber, we're left over with a starch-rich fraction that can go in the bioplastics or other applications, and protein for the food or feed industry. Now, when we start looking at positioning our Faba bean ingredients, because they are emerging, we have to think about a number of things. Functionality, obviously they have to perform well in various food applications, and through processing we can tailor their functionality to certain applications, whether it's high solubility for a beverage, or good water and oil holding for a meat analog type application, or a gelled type product like tofu. Another area that we have to think about is nutrition, and so we'll talk a little bit about, Chris mentioned anti-nutritional properties, protein quality. So there's big concern about the nutrition and making sure that when we blend it, we have a complete amino acid profile for consumers. And then flavor. So there are a number of flavor reduction strategies people are using. The most common is some sort of thermal heat type treatment, but there's other ones that are less so, used more on the experimental side, using alcohol washes or absorbent resins. So there's some stuff in literature looking at ways that we can move flavor, but functionality, nutrition, and flavor are essential when we start emerging new ingredients into the marketplace, such as Faba bean. So I just wanted to present a case study, and this is from one of my master's students, in which we looked at 3 Canadian Faba bean cultivars, Fabel, Malik, and Snowbird, and each of these differed in properties like tannins or the vicine, convicine, and that's why we chose them. And we looked at the flour composition and nutrition, specifically about the protein quality and the anti-nutritional properties. And then we looked at the isolates and looked at composition, nutrition, but also functionality, and how do those change in this process. Composition, I don't want to highlight too much about this. And so we also put some references in there, so pea and soya as an example of just where position Faba bean is. So in the flour, for instance, we're looking at 30 to 35% protein. versus P, which is at 23%. Now, Snowbird, which was interesting, had 35 or 34% protein, so it actually had a higher protein content than Fabel and Malik. All the Faba beans was low in fat, similar to other pulses. When we looked at the isolates, we had really good extractions. We got high protein purity, so 90% up to 97% in the Snowbird variety. So we are able to retain a lot of that protein in this process, recovering about 70%, 75% of the protein in the wet extraction process, which is comparable to pea and soya. So this gives us confidence that the wet extraction process works well for Faba and produce high quality ingredients at the other end. So if we look at the nutritional properties of Faba bean and then we compare the pea and soya flours and isolates, there's a lot of data here, and I'll just try to boil it down. So we initially, when we did prior to looking at the flours, we dehulled, and the dehulling process removed a lot of the phenolic compounds and the tannins. So it's typically lower than you would see in the seed, especially the tannins. But one of the interesting thing is when we went from a flour to a concentrate or to an isolate, we concentrated the phenolics. So the phenolics followed the protein in there. And the phenolic compounds for Faba beans was sort of intermediate between pea and soya. So it's higher than pea, but less than soya. We also see a concentration of the phytic acid, and so phytic acid, can affect mineral absorption in your ingredients. So we saw a concentration of that in the isolation process. In this particular case, Fabello had higher levels of phytic acid than Snowbird or Malik when we looked at the Faba bean ingredients. Now, when we looked at vicine and convicine, the Fabel, which is considered to be a low vicine convicine value, had much lower levels than the Malik and Snowbird. And when we did the wet extraction process, we actually saw a lowering of all these values. So they were being removed from the water process. So we were able to remove not all of these, not as much as Chris presented some data in terms of heating and things like that, but yeah, the wet extraction process, we saw a lowering in the vicine convicine ingredients. When we looked at the oligosaccharides, so when we talk about pulses, the fermentable sugars, the total raffinose family oligosaccharides, they cause bloating and flatulence, which consumers don't like in terms of the properties of pulses and Faba beans. And one interesting thing is that in Faba beans there's less of the oligosaccharides than there are in, say, pea and soya. So which is a good note for Faba beans. The total amount of oligosaccharides is higher in the flour, so the isolation process removes some of these total oligosaccharides by about 75%. You see a rough reduction in that. And we also see the Faba beans tend to be have less raffinose and stachyose and more bromose than pea and soya. So we see differences in the oligosaccharide profile. So again, that can affect nutrition and the fermented sugars in your body. When we look at the protein quality, Faba beans, like other pulses, tend to be limiting in sulfur amino acids, so cysteine and methionine. Quite often, we also see them limiting in tryptophan. So if you notice the pea here, the pea is limiting in tryptophan, but they're very close. But most of them, in terms of the Faba, are lower in the sulfur amino acids. When we look at the amino acid score, the most limiting amino acid, again, it's the sulfur amino acids. But when we look at the flour, they are a little bit lower amounts than pea, and soya being complete, so that's above 1, so that's a complete protein source. Pea is very close to being complete, but we see a lowering in the faba flour. But one interesting an area that we can improve on is we see a lowering when we go to the isolate, from the flour to the isolate. We see a significant reduction in the amino acid score, and that's then reflected in the poorer protein quality. So our reasoning is that in the wet extraction process, we believe that we're losing albumin proteins, which is a water-soluble protein found in faba bean, and they tend to be richer in the sulfur amino acids. So the fractionation process, I think there's some room to improve in order to retain some of these albumin proteins and retain some of the sulfur amino acids that we're losing in the wet extraction process. Looking at the in vitro protein digestibility, we see an increase in the isolate, and that's because when we move over to the protein quality, they're significantly lower than pea and soya, and that's due to the limiting amino acid score lowering. So this is not bad news for faba. We talked about eating it as part of a complementary diet, so combining it with other cereal proteins to get that complete amino acid profile. So blending it will be really important for the industry moving forward. So just some conclusions about the nutritional side. The phenolic and tannins were removed in the dehulling process quite a bit. Phytic acid was intermediate in the faba beans relative to pea and soya, and found to be highest around the fabel isolates. Vicine and convicine was greatest in snowbird, followed by malic and fabel. And then when we moved to the isolates, those levels declined further. And the fermentable sugars were in faba bean was less than pea and soya, which makes it attractive. The faba bean ingredients had good digestibility, but had lower amounts of sulfur amino acids, and there's some work to do in the isolation process to retain some of those amino acids in the process. So just moving on into functionality, solubility is really important, and so here we have fabel, malic, and snowbird. They have comparable solubility as soya, slightly better than pea, and so this is done at pH 7. So this is really good for beverage applications in these particular isolates. Now you got to remember that we made these isolates in the lab. Sometimes commercial processes in which have a drying step, typically they can have more denaturization and reduced solubility depending on your commercial process. Looking at the water and oil holding capacities, they're very comparable to between pea and soya. So if we're looking to replace soya or pea in say a meat binding application or a meat analog, faba bean is comparable and could have a good opportunity in that respects. Looking at the foaming property, I know there's a lot of data here. I just wanted to sort of boil down these into 3 main points. We looked at all cultivars at different pHs. The foaming properties were similar between the faba bean and pea, and these were such it was lower for that of soya, so the soya did not foam as well as the faba bean and pea, which is really nice. Foaming properties were less at pH 5. So proteins have what's called an isoelectric point. So here they carry no net charge. So at that pH, the solubility tends to be less. So basically the proteins can have less ability to migrate to the air-water interface to create the foam. So we see actually foaming improve at pH 7 and 3, where solubility and integration and interface is a lot more. When we look at the emulsifying properties, fabel and malic were similar to pea, but snowbird had much lower emulsion forming abilities, but they had greater stability. Now, snowbird had I didn't present the data here, but they had higher amounts of legumin protein. than the other faba beans. And the legumin protein is bigger, it's less flexible, so it's harder to align at the interface than some of the other ones that are higher in the viscellin protein. Now, the emulsion activity was greatest at pH 7, so it formed the best emulsions, and followed by pH 3 and 5, so that impacted by solubility, whereas the emulsion stability was less. Just some conclusions on the functional properties. The faba bean cultivars were higher comparable functionality than yellow pea and soya, so this is great news and shows potential of integrating these ingredients into the food industry. Snowbird had the highest amount of protein and again the highest amount of legumin, which did affect its emulsifying properties versus the other faba beans. But the big thing is that the faba bean proteins, because they have comparable functionality, they could be used to replace pea and soya in different food applications. So just moving on to some potential applications. There's when we look at applications, we have whole flour, starch concentrates, protein concentrates, and isolates. And if you look in the literature and in product development, sometimes these ingredients are further treated, whether it's through fermentation or roasting or micronization, extrusion, enzymes. So I'll give some examples about high pressure processing. So no matter what ingredient we have, we can always do further processing and to alter its functional properties and ingredients. So it's not just about the raw material and the feedstock, it's about how we process it and how we treat the ingredients afterwards that can give unique functionality. So faba beans, I did a survey on different food applications or in baked goods, pasta, enriched products that are fortified with faba bean, gluten-free products. These products, especially for baked goods, are looking to increase the protein content, the fiber, the mineral content of these gluten-free products. They're in flatbreads like pita and tortillas, plant-based meat alternatives, milk and cheese and yogurt. So all these really good questions. Egg-free mayonnaise or mixtures, puff snacks, and beer as adjuncts for that. So a number of applications because it is a very versatile ingredient. So these are just examples of studies I pulled out of the literature. One was making a clean label bread formulation, mainly with rice flour and faba bean flour. And they applied a high pressure homogenized treatment to break up the protein aggregates to make it more digestible. And then they added enzymes. And they were able to make a bread product at a 2-to-1 ratio with really great crumb structure. So that's a microstructure of the bread and good textural attributes. Another study looked at pasta using a corn faba bean blend. And they use a single screw extruder to make the pasta, and they did it at 100 degrees Celsius. They found at lower, the faba bean resulted in a stickier pasta. But a lot of these products, whether it's bread or pasta, they're combining these with cereal. So this is where we see the blending. And not only are they upping the protein content in the bread or the pasta by incorporating the faba bean, upping the fiber content, the micronutrients, and the protein quality is actually being improved because you're blending the essential amino acids to get that to happen. Some other examples are the non-dairy alternatives. So typically, say when you're making a plant-based yogurt, they're using fermented plant-based milks. And that can create some off flavors or different flavor profiles that sometimes is really difficult to control in the process. So this particular study, they used not fermentation, but they took the plant-based milk and they used high pressure processing to cause the protein to denature and form structures to make this yogurt type consistency. And they found that the high protein faba bean gels had very similar textural attributes as the Greek-based yogurt. So had a different or unique process rather than using fermentation to make the yogurt. Just another example of faba bean ingredients being used. And then it's been used to make mayonnaise. So the protein isolates are being used, and they're often used in combinations to get the right textural attributes. So this first I use a faba bean chickpea mixture. There was oil in that mayonnaise as well, so it's a way to modify the texture of that. And this second study used ultrasound and enzyme extracted protein isolates, so from faba beans. So they use ultrasounds to break up some of the proteins and change the structure, making them more susceptible to the enzymes for digestion. Then they had this modified protein isolate, which they use and try to make a mayonnaise type product. And they didn't have huge success with 100% replacement of faba bean with egg, and they resulted in sort of a 1 1/2 faba bean egg yolk replacement, and showed good functionality. So just to acknowledge some important funding sources of the data that I presented in this talk. The Agri Science Program, so the Canadian Pulse Science Cluster, which is really critical and moving forward into the next round of funding to push the pulse industry further. And Pulse Canada has been a leader in that, along with the grower associations. National Science of Engineering Research Council, the CREATE program that I lead here at the university, also helped funded some of the research, and Pulse Canada in terms of some of the application and some of the work there. I also like to take a moment to thank the research team, Dave Shee, who was a master's student, did a lot of the work, and some of my close collaborators that contributed to the faba bean work, Andrea Stone from the U of S, Janita Wanasundera from Agri-Food Canada, and James Host from the University of Manitoba. So I'm happy to take any questions. Here's my email in case someone has some other questions later on that comes to you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. What a content-filled presentation. I think it was very informative. We have just a few really seconds left. And so we're going to actually just address some of the questions. And of course, we can do some follow-up as well. But just some questions. I think you outlined, there was some just clarity about the different ingredients that are generated from the fractionation process. But just to summarize, there's like 3 subsets of ingredients. And if you can just highlight the protein purities of those, that's the concentrates, isolates, the flours for faba beans.
Yeah, so flours, you're looking at about a dehulled flour, you're probably up towards 33-35%. And air classified concentrate, you're upwards around 65%, 60-65%. And for an isolate, you can get over 90%.
Okay, so those are some pretty high levels that are unique to faba. Do you see any bioactive compounds in faba beans that help in autism, diabetes? Okay, that's more of a health, but any comment on that? Just
no, I haven't.
okay.
I haven't read any, especially on autism about that. You know,
Okay.
I'm not. I don't dig too much into the health literature.
Yeah.
So I couldn't answer that. Chris might be a better one.
We can follow up with that. And this other question was the high pressure treatment done on the dough. So you had some examples there.
Yeah, that was done on the ingredients separately. So it was used as a treatment to modify the structure of the protein, whether it's in aggregates or to open up the structure, and that made it more reactive and functional, which was then used as a dough. So they didn't do the high pressure on the dough itself. They used it on the faba bean ingredients.
Okay, great. And then I think just one last question. I think this one's interesting. It was asked earlier, but is there any evidence on faba bean cold set gels like silken tofu, so the more softer tofu? Have you come across anything just in literature or your experience?
No, I haven't seen a lot on that. Faba bean, we've done some work in the lab. It is a good gelling agent. So it has good gelling properties. But there hasn't been a lot of work, at least in the literature on developing the tofu based. And I'm not aware of any commercial products that are based on that.
Okay, it's a new area, and I think there's interest and there's opportunity to explore further. Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike, for the presentation and answering those last questions. And so we've come to the end, and I know we're a little over, but we wanted to set the stage for what's to come for next week. And so it's obviously a very exciting time for fava beans. We heard a lot today, and we got the history lesson, 10,000 years ago, fava bean plants in Europe, and we're all the way today where we have new varieties that are growing right now, and they are working towards meeting the needs of the global food industry. So lots of data there, and all of this information is recorded and available to you right after we conclude here. And so I think I would like to just take the time right now to thank all the speakers for sharing their knowledge on fava beans. And we hope that you found this event to be very valuable. We're going to reconvene next week, the same time, for the second portion of this event. And we'll have a bit more of a commercial discussion on where the fava bean industry is headed. And I wanted to also note that the platform will remain open all week until the next session. So there's some time you can review the recording if you like. And it's in the resources section of this platform. So that should be clear. If you can't find it, contact one of us. You can also, again, access the list of trade and supplier members under the Canadian Special Crops Association. And with that, we'll formally close part one of the Faba Bean Micro Summit. So we'll see you all next week.